A recent civil rights complaint and a simultaneous whistleblower report claim human rights abuses are occurring at a local immigrant detention center. To discuss the allegations and renewed pressure to close the Baker County ICE facility, we're joined on the phone by Amy Godshall, immigrant rights attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union of Florida. Good morning, Amy.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you for joining us. I'm also joined here
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Sure. We're also joined in Studio 2 by Vilerka Bilbao. I'm sorry, Vilerka Bilbao. Apologize. I thought I had that. Who chairs the Baker Committee of the Central Florida chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Good morning, Vilerka.
Good morning.
All right, Amy, I'm going to start with you. This ICE facility has been getting renewed attention lately, including media coverage here and abroad. Um, it's not the first time that Baker's ICE detention center has been the subject of complaints, though. Is that right?
That's correct. The ACLU of Florida and several other advocacy organizations doing immigrants' rights work in the state have been investigating various complaints. We've gotten hundreds of complaints from people at Baker over the past few years about a wide variety of issues occurring at the facility.
And so what is the history of when these complaints began and how are the new complaints different?
The new complaints are not in tension with the previous complaints. They're building onto them. So we've gotten a lot of similar complaints before. There's been several Prison Rape Elimination Act violations that have occurred at the facility. We've gotten voyeurism complaints before, which is similar to the complaints that we put out for our client recently. The thing that is new this time is that there was a whistleblower who came forward about she worked at the facility and disclosed a range of abuses that occurred. And a lot of her allegations support the complaints that we've been putting out for years now, disclosing that the food is inedible, moldy, the water is not clean, there's not enough water, the clothing is unhygienic, people get rashes from wearing the clothing that's just not clean. So she confirmed all of those abuses and conditions issues that we've been talking about for years, but she goes beyond that and talks about how within the medical department where she worked, she was told to manipulate records and backdate records falsely. That she saw fraud happening. She found over 30 of her patients' records who had forged medical refusals, where Baker officers had forged I don't want this medication, forged a refusal when the person, and then she would speak with the person and say, why didn't you follow up with this prescription and this plan I had provided for you? And they said they were never offered the medicine in the first place. They did want it, but Baker was forging documents to get out of providing care for people. And they were doing this to avoid being caught in an ICE audit.
I want to talk more about the whistleblower and her position there. But Valerka, why does the Immigrant Lawyers Association have a Baker County committee in particular?
We formed this committee recently, and it's so that we can start monitoring what is happening at Baker. Um, Many of our attorneys have complained about lack of access to counsel, what the things that Amy is talking about, the fact that detainees are not able to get medical health, things that they are supposed to be getting while they're detained, and even abuse, physical abuse, use of solitary confinement in ways that's not um, correct. So, ALA, the Central Florida chapter, this is the only detention center that we have in North Florida. We made the determination that it would be wise for us to start monitoring what happens and then teaching local attorneys how to fight these cases, how to file civil rights complaints, how to represent individuals in these situations.
And for people who aren't familiar, the Baker County facility is kind of half a county jail and half an uh, ICE detention facility. It's a large facility, up to 500 people that it can hold, built with, the intention that there was going to be a large population of deportees at the jail. Currently, there is a lot of discussion about, what will happen under the president-elect's term. He's promised mass deportations. What is it about this facility that informs how that could look if, in fact, those large-scale deportations begin to happen?
From client experiences, especially those who have been in maybe multiple detention centers, they've described Baker as one of the worst places to be at, worse than a state prison. And it's because the conditions are so bad. We know that there's flooding, that there's mold on the walls, that there's food that cannot be consumed. And we think at the end of the day, most of this happens because of costs. The detention center doesn't want to spend any money on the detainees because it cuts into their profit. But they are required to provide a certain standard of care, including medical care, to those who are in their detention center.
So, Congressman Maxwell Frost, he represents the Orlando area. He conducted a surprise visit recently to the facility. And when you talk about conditions there, he had some interesting things to say. So, let's hear a little bit about what he had to say about the facility.
What I saw was horrible. Part of the reason that there's these horrible conditions are number one, no investment, and there's not a care in the world about the quality of life of the folks who are there and being detained. But number two, part of me feels like it's part of the process. It's so bad that these people want to just drop their process and stop fighting against their own deportation. I remember there was one guy I was talking with who said, I just kind of gave up on fighting my deportation because this is worse than anything I've ever experienced. And they're sending me back to Haiti. For people who don't know, Haiti right now is hell on earth for a lot of people. And he said, I rather like risk and fight for my life on the street of Haiti right now, where it's insane anarchy, versus be in this center where he's not serving a sentence, but he's playing out a process.
So, Valerka, is that consistent with the kinds of things that you hear? People who would rather be deported, even if their country of origin is a very hostile place, than be in that facility?
Yes, yes. I've had clients who lose, for example, their asylum case and they have a right to appeal that case, but the judges will say you are going to remain detained if you fight your case, and an appeal takes over 2 years. Nobody wants to be detained for 2 years to wait on an administrative decision from a court, and they would rather go back to harm than sit there for 2 years in detention.
Amy, I understand that the majority of, well, I shouldn't say that. The majority of inmates, but not much more than half, are deported. But about 40% are ultimately not deported after their case is resolved. People who've been detained in this facility. Um, so these are people that very much their fate is in question. There's no guarantee that they're going to be deported. And I guess it's sort of up to the agency to decide whether or not somebody is detained during their court procedures or not. So what determines that for your clients?
Yeah, so ICE has broad discretion regarding who they detain in ICE detention. So everyone who is detained in ICE detention is awaiting removal proceedings, the same thing as deportation proceedings in other terms. But not everyone who is currently in removal proceedings is being detained while those proceedings are pending, often for years, as Vilerka mentioned. So it's really, often we find it arbitrary to figure out who is going to be detained or not detained while they await that case process. And it's really, so it's supposed to be civil detention. It's not for people who are awaiting or serving a criminal sentence. It's not supposed to be for people to languish for a punishment. It's just ICE's like arbitrary discretion for who they detain while they're there. And as Rep. Frost was getting at it, it often does feel like ICE does not care to hold these facilities accountable because they're happy when people self-deport.
So the whistleblower, this is a nurse practitioner that gave her account to the ACLU, which in turn you've turned over to the Department of Homeland Security to review. But you've also filed.
We do not represent the whistleblower. The whistleblower is represented by the Government Accountability Project, and they have filed her complaint. We are not. We did not write her complaint. We are not representing her.
Okay, very good.
CHS.
You did file a civil rights complaint on behalf of a client who you're using the name Anna to protect her identity. But tell us what kind of allegations she's making.
Yeah, so she experienced a range of abuses, as is common at Baker. So while she was at Baker, she is a Spanish speaker. She doesn't speak English. She asked to use the bathroom when an officer came and was going to take her group to rec. She wanted to use the bathroom to change her pad before going out to rec, and the officer started yelling at her in English, which she still didn't understand, even though it got louder. And then they took her to solitary for not following the English command that she didn't understand. And she had been trafficked prior to entering Baker, and so she was already suffering from PTSD, anxiety, depression, and being put in solitary for not understanding English command gave her a panic attack. And instead of providing mental health care, things just got worse while she was in solitary. And she was in there for over a month. And at one point, she was having another panic attack because Baker didn't let her attend her child custody proceedings, and she was scared she was going to lose her son, and they weren't letting her call her attorney. And so she was banging her head against the door with a mental health crisis. And instead of providing her again with mental health care, male guards came in and stripped all of her clothes off. Instead of explaining anything in Spanish about what was going on or actually helping her through it, they took her clothes off, put her in a ripped suicide smock, and strapped her to a restraint chair with her breast exposed. And the officers were laughing at her while it was happening, and they kept peeking in the cell window at her after that. It was egregious. No one should ever be treated like that. And then the whistleblower also was working at Baker while Anna was there, and the whistleblower saw during a staff meeting, they played a video of this incident, this use of force incident, and all of the officers, again, watching the video were laughing, and they played it as an example of a good use of force.
So this initially began as a conflict over a hygiene product, and that is also the source of a lot of other complaints at that facility, that there is not sufficient toilet paper, that there is not sufficient sanitary napkins provided to women when they're menstruating.
Yeah.
Explain to us, because that also is part of a separate complaint about conditions at the facility. Why is it that there aren't enough sanitary napkins being provided?
So a couple of years ago, I think it was in the spring of 2022-ish, the Baker keeps the facility at, I think it's 53 degrees. It's very cold in the facility all the time. And so women at the facility, the clothes are given are really thin. They were using pads to keep warm because they were freezing cold in the facility. And Baker's response to that was to limit the number of pads given instead of making the temperature warmer in the facility. So per ICE national detention standards, women are supposed to get the sufficient supply of sanitary pads. So it's not, it's a Baker policy that is punitive, and it also cuts against national detention standards that they're supposed to be following. Baker is supposed to be providing sufficient toilet paper and sufficient sanitary pads, but they're choosing to not pay for all of those products and to make punitive policy decisions when people try and advocate for their rights.
And Amy, you've understood that they're actually being directed to use socks for either toilet paper or sanitary napkins because they're not being provided.
I don't think that's a directive from Baker, but that's what the whistleblower saw happening while she was there, because people were between each disbursement of toilet paper, people were running out of toilet paper. And what else do they have to use except for a sock for number one and a sock for number two? So I assume officers didn't tell them. I don't know for sure how that started, but the whistleblower saw this happening regularly while she was working there.
Now, Vilerka, Sheriff Scotty Roden, who's in charge of this facility, is not able to comment. There is pending litigation brought by the ACLU a couple years ago, but the Department of Homeland Security did do a surprise visit on the facility, the McClenny facility, their Office of Inspector General. They found, according to their report, that Baker and ICE staff did comply with standards for grievances, recreation, segregation, facility conditions, and medical care, that they did not comply with a couple of other standards related to the voluntary work program, staff detainee communications, and use of force. So I would ask your thoughts on their findings, both that the facility was in compliance and then the items where they found they weren't.
Yeah, I think Congress needs to do a better job at looking at the records, because what the whistleblower is telling us in her complaint is that they have been falsifying medical records. So how could they be found compliant with providing adequate medical care when they've been falsifying records? This is something that has been going on for years. There have been guards who have sexually assaulted individuals who were at Baker, and they remained as employees for a long time. And if we go back, I mean, there's probably at least 20 years worth of history of abuses happening at Baker. I think that Congress's the Office of Inspector General's reports are need to be looked at again, especially given this new information that we have that Baker has been falsifying records.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about conditions at the Immigration Detention Center in Baker County, which has been the subject of recent civil rights and whistleblower complaints. You can join our conversation at 904-549-2937. You can also email questions or comments to First Coast Connect at wjct.org or reach out on social media. Um, Amy, this facility has also been the site of former hunger strikes in 2022. More than 100 inmates participated in that hunger strike protest at that time. Remind us of what happened and how that was resolved.
Yeah, so people were trying to advocate for their rights and speak out because these conditions were just as bad then. And so people joined together and were going to go on a peaceful hunger strike. According to federal detention standards, people are allowed to engage in hunger strikes. It was peaceful. There was nothing wrong with what they were planning to do. They were trying to stand up for themselves and their civil rights. And in response, the Baker officers acted punitively and retaliatory, as we see happen often in this kind of situation when people try and stand up for themselves. So the officers, Baker shut off all access to water at the facility. So you couldn't use water to brush your teeth. You couldn't flush the toilet. It got very unsanitary and unhygienic very quickly. And Baker, so you have to be considered a hunger strike, you have to miss a certain amount of meals in a row. And Baker was attempting to cut off the hunger strike and punish people into resuming eating meals again before it technically got to the level of hunger strike, which would have triggered other reporting policies on Baker's side.
And I believe that they didn't deny turning off the water, but rather were justifying it, saying they were trying to measure the actual intake of water by inmates. So they would be providing them
Correct.
water rather than allowing them to access it, say, through a fountain or a tap.
Correct. Yeah, they'll say it's whatever, but there was another report that came out this past summer where some former officers, former guards, also acknowledged that wasn't the real reason. So we've spoken with people and heard several accounts of that not being the true reason.
Okay. So, Vilerka, in talking to attorneys who are working at that facility, there have been a couple of concerns that have been reported. One about conditions in the law library, which is a facility that inmates often use to help build their cases or find information to share with their attorneys. What are the concerns about the facility's law library at the ICE detention in Baker County?
One of the big things is there's no access to documents in other languages. Um, Many of the non-citizens who are fighting an immigration case speak a different language. There's very little access to computers. There's been reports that officers erase information that's on hard drives. So if an inmate or a detainee starts, writing up a motion or saving some documents for their cases, those documents are then deleted. There's also the issue of privacy with your attorney. We do know that there is one cabin where um, people detained can have a conversation with their attorney that's private and confidential, but oftentimes it's either booked or not functioning, or we're not able to speak to them through there. So there's just a lot of barriers for individuals to be able to represent themselves, or even if they have an attorney, be able to work with their attorney to obtain good representation in their case.
And it's my understanding that there also aren't supplies like pens or papers or even any books in the law library.
Correct.
Yeah. So, Amy, the ACLU has tried to do some training on site with the inmates just to inform them of their rights and let them know what they need to do if they're, needing a representation. Tell us about what's happened when you've tried to do those in facility trainings.
Yeah, so ACLU of Florida is working in conjunction with several immigration clinics across the state at various law schools. And we've formed the Detention Advocacy Program. And through this program, each law school will visit Baker once a semester. In theory, that's the goal. And so when these clinics go, they put a sign-up sheet ahead of time so that people who would like to meet with an attorney and hear a Know Your Rights presentation they can sign up to go. And there have been several instances recently when certain groups within the facility are not allowed. The Baker officers don't bring their pods to visits at all. So there's several times when we've been concerned about people actually being able to access or being denied access to these Know Your Rights presentations in the first place. The last visit that our partners conducted, we heard complaints from them about how the officers were bringing in small groups at a time really slowly. So it just really delayed how many rounds of the presentation they were able to get through. And so we see several examples of that kind of behavior from the Baker officers. It seems clear to us that they are trying to obstruct access to the Know Your Rights presentation at all. And it's hard to get in and actually investigate what is happening behind the scenes because they're good at covering up their tracks. But we've seen a pattern of this happen, and we're looking into it.
Well, if you're just joining us, we were talking about conditions and allegations of conditions at the Baker County ICE Detention Center. You can join our conversation by calling 904-549-2937 or emailing firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. We have a call from Charles on the west side. Good morning, Charles. Go ahead.
Good morning. I was wondering if either the state government can help out with the situation, or if there's a division of the feds that is responsible for this that could help out. But I know in this current climate now, I guess we can't really count on the feds that much, can we?
Thanks, Charles. Vilerka, I mean, what is the federal interest in doing anything to intervene in these situations?
That's the thing. ICE and the Department of Homeland Security haven't been very responsive. This is a prison or a detention center that's run by a county jail, and so they have a contract to house federal detainees that are in there for immigration purposes. And so there is supposed to be some sort of supervision happening from the Department of Homeland Security about what's happening. But if their reports say that this jail detention center is, checking all the boxes, then we have a real problem because they are also rubber stamping some of these abuses that are happening. From the state level, I don't think that there's going to be any interest or really any power to do much. This is going to have to come from the federal government to overlook, and they can cancel the contract with Baker so that Baker does not continue to house immigrant detainees. And this is something that has happened before where, either private prisons or county jails don't meet the national detention standards or are so egregious in their violations that the federal government says, I don't want to be doing business with them. And this is certainly something that the Department of Homeland Security can consider.
But we should say this is a moneymaker for the county. I mean, this is a really small county with a population somewhere around 28,000 with a 500-bed facility, which is large for that county's needs. It cost about $45 million, which is many, many millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars more than the entire county budget. So the revenue that they get from housing these inmates is no small matter to a small rural county like Baker County.
Yeah, so you would think that the Baker sheriff is interested in making sure that he's complying with the national detention standards, that he's complying, that his officers are not committing human rights abuses, that his officers are not using excessive force. But instead, it's almost like he's allowing it to happen and putting that at risk for the entire county of Baker, who depends on that stream of income.
Yeah. So, Amy, just tell us what next steps. I mean, this has been getting some attention publicly. There's obviously these, filings that have been done, the civil rights complaint. But what do you expect will happen next?
Yeah, so if people want to get involved and help us push, because it is, like as Becca was saying, it is up to DHS to act at this point. Baker County is not interested in shutting down the facility, as you were getting at, and the state does not seem interested either. So the next step is to put more pressure on DHS to make sure they're aware of everything that's actually happening at the facility. And Rep. Frost has publicly called for Baker to be shut down. Dick Durbin has called for an investigation and for there not to be anyone else sent, no more detainees sent to Baker until the investigation is complete. So we are getting some traction at the federal level. And if people want to get involved in that push, we have a petition on our website. People can sign, and you can call your representatives as well, and to try and help push DHS this direction.
Well, Amy Godshall, Vilerka, Bilbao, thank you both so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.